The median house price in the US in 1970 was approximately $23,400, less than 2.5 times the median family income at the time. By last year, the median home price was more than $400,000, about 5 times the median family income. No surprise that people are warning about a housing affordability crisis. To what extent is that driven by the increasing cost of building homes? Welcome to the Chicago Booth Review podcast, where we bring you groundbreaking academic research in a clear and straightforward way. I'm Hal Weitzman, and today I'm talking with Chicago Booth's Chad Syverson about his research on the weak link between building costs and home prices. What's really behind the price increases in residential real estate? Chad Syverson, welcome back to the Chicago Booth Review podcast.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
We're here to talk about housing costs, and which everyone cares about, and building costs, which we also care about, but maybe less than we'll find out if we care about it less than we currently do. Your main finding in this research is that increases in building costs don't explain increases in housing costs in the U.S., or housing prices rather in the U.S., and that connection is actually weakened over recent decades. Why?
That is right. That's what we find. It's not clear exactly why that connection has weakened, but it does suggest that things that determine house prices, other than just the actual cost of putting the structure together, have become increasingly more and more important in determining what house prices are. Now, those things can be like the prices of land, the legal costs involved with getting the right to build, things like permitting and those sort of associated costs. And so we've seen this disconnect now between changes in how expensive it is to actually build a structure from what that structure ends up getting sold for.
Okay, but just to play devil's advocate, why would we expect, you go and buy a house, nobody says, well, here's how much a brick costs. There are so many bricks. I mean, that's not the way that people buy housing. So why would we expect building costs to have such a the increase to have an effect on the increase in house prices?
In general, we think that the prices of products reflect both demand and supply factors. And for a lot of physical products, one big supply side factor is the cost of actually assembling the product. And that's true for, if cars, often don't go into a dealership and get told, well, each one of those tires costs $185, and therefore you're going to have to pay $40,000 for the car. But that's actually kind of part of what's going on. All those parts have a cost, and that gets added up, and that has some determination in figuring out what the price of that car is going to be. It so happens that we're finding for houses that connection is just loosened.
Right. And is that a surprise to you?
Yeah, I would have thought, cost side stuff matters in general. And I wasn't expecting it would explain all the changes in house prices, but I thought it would explain some. It used to, but as we've found, as time has gone along, the ability of changes in building costs to explain price changes has just gone basically to zero. Okay.
And so it's not clear why that disconnect is happening, but you talked about some of the other factors. Just list those. So building costs the increase in building costs not driving house prices. What is?
For clarification purposes, what we're actually measuring with building costs is, imagine you've got a piece of land and it's ready to be built on. The government said, okay, go ahead, you can build a house, you have permission, start. It's the actual cost from that point of assembling the structure. You already have the architecture and engineering done too, that's not in. So if we're not finding that building costs explain changes in prices anymore, if costs matter at all, it must be coming from those other things. So the cost of the land, cost of permitting, costs of engineering and architecture, that kind of stuff. That has to be the cost side factors that are moving around that change prices. There can also be changes in demand too. So just holding fixed whatever the costs are, land, everything else, if more people want more houses all of a sudden, that's going to tend to drive up the prices of houses as well.
Okay. So you distinguish between building costs and what you call the full cost of bringing a new house to market? Does that include some of the costs you
That's
talked about?
all. That's the land
Yeah.
and the engineering and all that stuff.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. So, and that distinction is important because there's the other stuff, as you say, that is driving the cost, presumably.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So you note that that construction-related prices of all sorts grew faster than consumer price index since 1950. So what does that tell us about inflation and construction housing market compared to the broader economy?
It tells us something interesting that was also raised by earlier work I did with Austin Goolsbee on productivity in the construction industry. If you were to do that same comparison, not for construction or houses, but for manufactured products, so how have the changes of goods that we make in manufacturing, how has that change? How have those changed over the last 75 years compared to average price changes? Those in general have seen slower price increases. And the reason why is we've gotten better, we've become more productive at the manufacturing process. So we can make physical goods more cheaply than we used to. So their real cost relative to everything else has gone down. That's not what has happened, as you've noted, in construction and housing in particular. So what's a bit of a mystery, I think, and this was something we were grappling with in the earlier work with Austin too, is that you might think, putting together a manufactured good isn't that different from putting together a house or some other structure that the construction sector puts together. Yet, in that first case, we seem to get better and better at it decade after decade, costs falling. But with construction, not only are costs not falling, they're actually rising faster than other prices in the economy are. So this result of this 75-year run of higher than average cost growth is sort of reflecting that.
And we talked in the previous podcast about productivity in the construction sector and we've got videos on Chicago Booth Review website where we talk more about your research on poor productivity in construction. So, but this divergence that you talked about between the increase in construction costs and the increase in house prices, you trace back to the late 1970s, and then by the late 1990s, house prices overtake the construction costs. How do you explain that? Why did we get that divergence starting then? What was happening?
Yeah, so one thing to remember is the cost growth was sort of continuing throughout that period, and as we were just saying, it was kind of growing faster than inflation. What really happened was, on top of all that, house price growth in the late 70s started growing even faster than those already increasing construction costs were rising. Why that is still, it's probably related to the fact that, quite simply, we're not building housing at the same rate we were in decades prior to that. So we had a strong run of 20, 30 years after World War II, where we were building houses very quickly, as fast or faster than household formation, that is, where someone wants to go with their family and buy a house. And then we started lagging somewhere in the 80s or 90s behind household formation, and it's gotten worse and worse over the decades since. And that has led to even faster increases in house prices than in the cost of building those houses.
Okay. And there was two periods that you identify where this divergence really ramps up, right? House prices grow significantly faster than building costs in the mid-2000s, before the financial crisis, subprime mortgage crisis, of course, and then from the mid-2010s to today. So what's happening in those two periods?
I think you could say in both of those periods, there was a sudden increase in the demand to buy houses. The first one, I think people would say, the conditions required to get a mortgage, a loan to buy a house, became loosened relative to prior periods. And maybe there was something in the air, an excitement about buying houses, maybe for personal use or investment property, when combined with easier access to credit, that led to a big increase in demand for houses. And so you saw this large spike in house prices. That was the first period. that you mentioned. The second is actually just the past 5 years coming out of COVID. There, it's, I think, less because of credit conditions, but it is related to the desire to buy a house, and probably because desired household formation changed a lot because of the pandemic. I think a lot of people wanted either or, not just household formation, just amount of housing went up. So people realized their house had a lot of uses they didn't think about until they had to stay there all day long or felt like they had to stay there. And so there was this big increase in the demand for space. And then a set of young adults who were living at home during the pandemic wanted to move out afterwards. And so you had this rather sudden shift in the desire for housing. And when you put
and they want big houses too, because they're all
everyone,
working from home.
Exactly. Everyone wants bigger houses than we had before. People want houses who didn't have houses before. We hadn't been building houses very quickly before, and we certainly weren't building houses very quickly during the pandemic. And so you get this big spike in demand with very limited supply, and it drives up the price of houses.
So when you talked earlier about what's driving this, is it those demand factors? That makes a lot of sense. You know, people want bigger houses, that suddenly they're going to be working from home, or there's loose credit and suddenly anyone can buy a house. Or I'm thinking about things like Airbnb. You know, suddenly you can buy a string of properties and actually make money from them, or more money than you could just by renting them out in the old days. So there's a whole load of stuff driving the demand side. What about the cost side that you talked about earlier, like the permitting and the architecture? I mean, is that really going up that much?
Well, there's certainly a lot of debate now about building restrictions, zoning, and the like, and just what a lot of folks view, and I think, in many places, is a general reluctance on the part of local governments to allow home building, and so that's raised the cost of the non-construction costs of building a house. So some of it's just literal permitting and government-related legal costs to build, but also just the restrictions on building get priced into the land itself. And so if you want to find an empty lot in, Venice Beach, LA, a place that's hard to build but people would like to build in, the lot is extremely expensive because in part it embodies the fact that it's really hard to build anything there, even though a lot of people want to build it. So it gets very expensive to buy a house there, not because it's necessarily expensive to construct a house, but because to get the land that gives you the right to construct that house has gone up.
Okay, so the permitting, the freeing up the land for property is still a big
that's
deal.
The cost side factor that I think has been moving around prices much more than the construction costs themselves.
Okay, but the demand is the thing that's driving this divergence.
Demand certainly matters, and that changes in demand get capitalized into the land prices. Yes.
So you mentioned your research on productivity, but I just want to get you to remind us what you actually found there, and then that stagnant productivity. How does that affect the cost of building and house prices?
Sure. So productivity is efficiency in production. It's basically how much output you get from a given set of inputs. What Austin and I found looking over the last 75 years in the construction sector is productivity growth has been very poor. In fact, it's actually been negative, which is really unusual for the last 50 years. That means if those statistics are correct, the amount of inputs that the construction sector needs to build whatever it's building has actually been going up. They need more and more inputs to build the same thing as they used to do. In other words, they've become less efficient at building stuff. Well, when you're less efficient, that means you need more inputs per unit output. That means your cost of building a unit output has gone up. So productivity growth is like the inverse of cost growth. Okay, so what Austin and I found about construction productivity says there's been a lot of increase in building costs over the last 50 years because of poor productivity growth in the construction sector. Now, what we're finding in this paper is, despite all that, there's also this other movement in house price growth That's not being explained by those rising construction costs. There are other things going on, and those other things are becoming even more and more important in explaining house prices than these construction costs are. Construction costs are still going up, and they're still going up faster than overall inflation. That's not a good situation. But on top of all that, there are these other things that are going into house prices, driving up the price of
So basically,
housing.
you told us things were bad, and now you're telling us they're even worse.
If you're in the house buying market, yes, things are getting worse and worse. It's more and more expensive all the time.
Chad Syverson, in the first half, we talked about your research about building costs and how the increase in building costs does not necessarily drive an increase in housing costs, and those two things have actually diverged in recent decades. And I want to get into talking about where you kind of observe some of these phenomena. And you say, for example, there's a big price cost disconnect in coastal cities like LA, San Francisco, New York, Boston. Why? What makes those cities different from places that have a smaller gap like Dallas and Houston?
Well, we were talking about the potential role of land prices, and I think a lot of the coastal phenomenon is variations in the cost of land moving around, being a huge part of what's explaining house prices. And there, I think the academic and the broader policy debate has settled on a big factor is it's just really hard to build houses in those areas. One, in part, there are some natural barriers. Certainly on the West Coast, you've got mountains near the coast in some of those metro areas. It's simply more expensive to build houses in mountainous areas. But probably actually most of it is coming from legal restrictions on building. Local governments tend not to be in those areas tend not to be very encouraging about building new houses, and that makes it very expensive to build because the right to buy or the ability to buy the right to build a house means you got to buy a patch of land where it's allowed, and so many people wanting only so many patches of land drives up the price of land and therefore the price of houses on top of it.
Okay, and in Dallas and Houston, just easier to build?
Yeah, and like I used to say, if you want to build another 1,000 houses